They say you don't notice when something starts to break. It's like a crack in a mirror. It begins small, almost invisible, until one day the whole thing shatters and you're left holding the jagged pieces. That's how it felt with me and Hannah. I'm Michael, a 35-year-old accountant in Cleveland, Ohio. I married Hannah 6 years ago, thinking I'd hit the jackpot. She was everything I wasn't: spontaneous, free-spirited, the kind of woman who could make strangers laugh within 5 minutes of meeting them. But somewhere along the way, that spark of hers started feeling like a threat. Her spontaneity became recklessness in my eyes. Her laughter at parties felt like a betrayal when it wasn't directed at me. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, I loved how different we were. I'd stay late at work, poring over spreadsheets and invoices, while Hannah would text me selfies from art galleries or random cafes she stumbled into. She was light to my dark, and I thought we balanced each other. But over time, my need for control began to suffocate her. I'd catch myself questioning her choices. Why are you wearing that dress? Or, do you really need another happy hour with your coworkers? I told myself it was love, that I just wanted to protect her. But if I'm honest, it was fear. Fear that she'd realize she could do better. Fear that her world was bigger than me. When Hannah told me about the party, I felt that familiar dread creeping in. It was a casual remark over dinner. Rebecca's hosting this thing Saturday night. You should come with me. Who's going to be there? I asked, my fork pausing midair. Just some friends from my old job, she said, not looking up from her plate. It'll be fun. But fun wasn't the word I heard. All I could picture was Hannah in a room full of strangers, people I didn't know, laughing and glowing the way she used to with me. I don't think that's a good idea, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. You don't even work with those people anymore. She looked up then, her eyes narrowing. Michael, it's just a party. I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I retreated to my usual weapon, silence. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Hannah scrolled through her phone next to me. The tension in the room was suffocating, but I refused to be the one to break it. If she wanted to go, fine. Let her. But she'd know exactly how I felt about it. Looking back, I realized that was the first real crack. But at the time, it just felt like another argument. One of hundreds. Saturday came like a storm cloud on the horizon. Dark, unavoidable, and suffocating. I spent most of the day trying not to think about it, but the more I tried, the heavier the thoughts became. I didn't ask Hannah about the party that morning. She didn't offer any details. We moved around the house like strangers, brushing past each other without a word. By 7 p.m., she was upstairs getting ready. I sat on the couch with the TV on, though I couldn't tell you what was playing. All I could hear was the faint hum of music coming from our bedroom and the occasional clink of makeup brushes against glass. My stomach churned every time I heard her laugh softly at something on her phone. Was she texting someone from the party? When she finally came downstairs, I barely recognized her. She was wearing a black dress that clung to her in all the right places, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders in soft waves. She looked dangerous, and for a moment, I hated how beautiful she was. How do I look? She asked, her voice light but guarded. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let my eyes scan her, searching for something, anything that I could criticize. But there was nothing. She was flawless. Like you're trying too hard, I said finally, my tone colder than I intended. Her smile faltered, but she didn't fight me. She just nodded, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the door. Hannah, I said, my voice stopping her mid-step. For a split second, I thought I might apologize, might tell her to stay home, that we could spend the night together and fix whatever was broken between us. But when she turned to look at me, all I managed was, "Don't drink too much." She didn't reply. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I was alone. The hours dragged by like years. I tried to distract myself, cleaning the kitchen, organizing the bookshelf, even flipping through one of her magazines. But no matter what I did, my mind kept returning to the party. Was she laughing with someone else? Dancing? Flirting? Around midnight, I gave in and checked her Instagram. Nothing. No stories, no posts, no clues. I hated how much that bothered me. Felt like she was hiding something, even if she wasn't. I went to bed around 2 a.m., though sleep didn't come easily. My dreams were fragmented, filled with images of Hannah surrounded by strangers, their hands on her waist, their lips on her neck. I woke up drenched in sweat, my fists clenched tightly around the sheets. By the time she came home the next morning, the sun was already up. I heard the door creak open, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I stayed in bed, pretending to sleep, but my heart was racing. "Michael?" she called softly. I didn't answer. She came into the bedroom, and I could feel her standing there, watching me. After a moment, she sighed and walked to the bathroom. I waited until I heard the water running before I opened my eyes. Her purse was on the floor by the bed. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to look inside. But then something caught my attention. Her neck. When she walked back into the room, she was wearing a robe, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders. But the marks were still there, faint but undeniable, 2 reddish-purple bruises, just below her collarbone. My chest tightened, my vision blurring with anger and disbelief. I sat up, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "What the hell is that on your neck?" She froze, her hand instinctively reaching up to cover the marks. "It's nothing," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Nothing?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You expect me to believe that?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say a word. And in that moment, the crack in the mirror became a gaping wound, splintering into 1,000 shards. The room felt like it was on fire, though neither of us moved. Hannah stood frozen, clutching the collar of her robe as if it could erase the marks, while I sat on the edge of the bed, my fists clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. "Tell me the truth, Hannah," I said, my voice low but shaking. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. "I told you, it's nothing," she repeated, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like poison. I could feel them seeping into my veins, making my head spin. "Do you think I'm an idiot? That I can't see what's right in front of me?" She flinched at my tone, but still, she said nothing. That silence was worse than any confession. It was an admission of guilt without words, a quiet rebellion against the control I thought I had. "Fine," I spat, standing up abruptly. "You don't want to talk? Then don't. I'm done trying to get the truth out of you." I stormed out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, though my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My mind was racing, playing out every possible scenario. Had she kissed someone? Slept with them? Who was he? Did she even feel guilty? The anger was suffocating, but beneath it, there was something worse. An ache in my chest that I couldn't ignore. The kind of ache that comes when you realize the person you love isn't who you thought they were. Or maybe they've stopped loving you altogether. For the rest of the day, I avoided her. When she came downstairs, I pretended not to notice. When she tried to speak, I walked out of the room. It wasn't the mature thing to do, but I didn't care. I wanted her to feel the weight of my silence, to know just how much she'd hurt me. She didn't push back. She didn't beg for forgiveness or try to explain herself. She just existed, moving through the house like a ghost, her presence a reminder of everything I didn't want to confront. By evening, the tension was unbearable. I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, when she finally broke the silence. "Michael," she said softly, standing in the doorway. Her voice was cautious, like she was afraid of setting me off. I didn't look at her. "I know you're angry," she continued, taking a hesitant step into the room. "But we can't just ignore this. Can't we?" I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "You've been doing a great job of it so far." Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she walked over and sat down on the couch across from me. "I made a mistake," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But it's not what you think." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, really? So those marks on your neck are just... what? Mosquito bites?" She opened her mouth to respond, but then closed it, shaking her head. "You won't believe me no matter what I say, will you? Try me." She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I was drunk," she admitted. "Someone kissed me. I didn't stop them right away, but I didn't want it to happen." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold on to the idea that this was just a mistake, something we could move past. But the anger in me wouldn't let go. "Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped. "You didn't want it to happen, but you let it? What kind of excuse is that?" Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't fight back. She just sat there, looking at me like she didn't recognize the person in front of her. And maybe she didn't. That night, I slept on the couch. Not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't stand the thought of being near her. The silence between us was deafening, a chasm that neither of us seemed willing or able to cross. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept circling in my mind. Was this the end? The next morning, the house was cloaked in a silence so heavy it felt like a third person in the room. I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck and an even stiffer resolve. I wasn't going to be the first to crack. If Hannah wanted to fix this, if fixing it was even possible, it would have to start with her. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, sipping coffee at the table. She looked tired, her eyes ringed with shadows that made her seem older, frilier. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Good morning," she said quietly, as if testing the waters. I didn't reply. I just grabbed a mug from the cabinet and poured myself some coffee. The clinking of the pot and cup the only sounds in the room. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, her voice firmer this time. "I don't think we do," I said, leaning against the counter. "You said what you had to say. I get it. You made a mistake." Her eyes flashed with frustration, but she kept her tone calm. "I don't know how to fix this if you won't even talk to me." "Fix this?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Do you think this is something you can just fix with an apology and a cup of coffee? What do you want me to say?" She shot back, her voice finally breaking. "I told you the truth. I admitted I was wrong. Do you want me to grovel? To beg? Because I will if that's what it takes." Her words hung in the air, raw and desperate. And for a moment, I felt the crack in my own armor. But instead of letting her in, I doubled down. "I want you to stop pretending like this is just about the party," I said, my voice low and cold. "This is about every choice you've made, every time you've put yourself above this marriage. You think I don't notice the way you look at other people? The way you act like you're still single?" Her face crumpled, but she didn't back down. "You're not being fair," she said. "You're twisting everything to make me the villain, when all I ever wanted was to feel like I still mattered to you." "You mattered to me," I snapped, "until I realized I was just an afterthought to you." The words cut deeper than I intended, and I saw the pain in her eyes before she turned away, retreating upstairs. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anger and avoidance. I threw myself into work, answering emails and crunching numbers like my life depended on it. Anything to keep my mind off the growing emptiness inside me. By evening, I realized Hannah hadn't come back downstairs. I found her in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands. She didn't look up when I walked in. "I'm going out," I said flatly, grabbing my jacket from the closet. "Out where?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Does it matter?" Her eyes met mine then, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, resignation. "Be careful," she said softly. For some reason, her words infuriated me. Be careful? After everything that had happened, she had the audacity to care where I went or what I did. I slammed the door behind me without responding, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. I ended up at a bar a few miles from the house, one I'd never been to before. It was dimly lit, crowded, the kind of place where no one asks questions and everyone has something to hide. I nursed a drink at the bar, staring into the amber liquid as if it held the answers I couldn't find. The noise around me faded into the background, replaced by the relentless thoughts in my head. Was Hannah telling the truth? Was I overreacting? Or was this the beginning of the end for us? A woman slid onto the stool next to me, her perfume sharp and cloying. She smiled, leaning in a little too close. Rough night. I didn't respond right away, my mind too foggy to register her presence. But then her hand brushed against mine, and I pulled back as if burned. Not interested, I muttered, turning away. She shrugged, muttering something under her breath before moving on. But the encounter left me shaken, a reminder of just how thin the line was between loyalty and betrayal. As I sat there, staring at the bottom of my glass, a question surfaced in my mind, one I couldn't ignore. Was I any better than Hannah? When I returned home that night, the house was dark and silent. It felt more like a tomb than the place I'd once thought of as a refuge. I dropped my jacket onto the chair by the door and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening for any sign of Hannah. Nothing. The anger I'd carried with me all day had cooled, but in its place was a hollow ache that I didn't know how to fill. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps heavy on the wooden steps, and paused outside our bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see her outline in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. She was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at something on her phone. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did and chose not to acknowledge me. Either way, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. "I'm back," I said, though it sounded more like a statement of fact than an invitation for conversation. She looked up, her eyes glassy and red-rimmed. "I didn't think you would be," she said quietly. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Where else would I go?" She didn't answer. Instead, she set her phone down and rested her chin on her knees, watching me like she was waiting for something. An apology, a fight, a sign that I cared enough to say what needed to be said. "I went to a bar," I said finally, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Needed some air." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Hannah," I said, my voice softer than before. "I can't do this. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't know how to fix it." The rawness in her voice tugged at something deep inside me, something I'd been trying to bury beneath my anger and pride. For all her flaws, for all the mistakes she'd made, she was still the woman I'd chosen to build a life with. And despite everything, part of me still wanted to believe we could find a way back to what we'd once had. But could I ever trust her again? "Tell me everything," I said, my voice firmer now. "No more half-truths, no more excuses. Just tell me what happened at that party." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the fabric of her pajama pants. "I already told you." "Not the version you think I want to hear," I interrupted. "The real story, Hannah. All of it." She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing as she searched for the words. "It was late," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd had too much to drink, and I was dancing with some friends. There was this guy, he was part of the group, someone Rebecca knew. He got too close." I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists. "Too close how?" Her eyes met mine, pleading. "He kissed me, Michael. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I didn't push him away fast enough. It was a mistake, one I'll regret for the rest of my life." The words hit me like a physical blow, but there was something in her tone, something raw and desperate, that made me pause. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the start?" I asked, my voice tight. "Because I knew you wouldn't believe me," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "And because I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared of what this means for us. For you. For me." Her vulnerability was disarming, cutting through the wall I'd built between us. But it also left me feeling more conflicted than ever. That night, I didn't sleep on the couch. I stayed in the bedroom, though the space between us felt like a canyon. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I replayed her words in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Was it really just a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness that she regretted? Or was it a symptom of something deeper, something broken between us that couldn't be repaired? I didn't have the answers, All I knew was that the crack in our marriage was now a chasm, and I wasn't sure either of us knew how to bridge it. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. The sheets on Hannah's side were cold, the imprint of her body already faded. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the weight of the night before. I thought about her words, the way her voice cracked as she admitted to the kiss. A mistake, she'd called it. But was that enough to explain everything? Did calling it a mistake somehow make it forgivable? I forced myself out of bed and headed downstairs, expecting to find her in the kitchen or curled up on the couch. But the house was eerily quiet. No clinking dishes, no hum of the coffee maker, just silence. "Hannah!" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty spaces. No response. I checked the bathroom, the guest room, even the garage. Her car was gone. For a brief, panicked moment, I thought she'd left me, that she'd packed her things and walked out without a word. But then I saw her purse on the counter, her phone plugged into the charger by the sink. She hadn't left for good. At least not yet. Hours passed, and the anxiety gnawed at me like a rat in the walls. I tried to distract myself with work, but every email felt trivial, every task pointless. My thoughts kept drifting back to her, to the look in her eyes when she told me the truth. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and texted her, "Where are you?" No reply. Minutes turned into hours, and the silence felt like a punishment. I paced the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Was she with him, the guy from the party? Or was she simply avoiding me, trying to figure out if this marriage was even worth saving? When she finally walked through the door, it was nearly dusk. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying all day. She set her keys on the counter and stood there, staring at me as if bracing herself for a fight. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked past me into the living room and sank into the couch, her body sagging like she was carrying the weight of the world. "I needed some time," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "To think." "Think about what?" I pressed, my frustration boiling over. "Whether you want to stay. Whether this marriage is worth fighting for." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, and there was a fire in them I hadn't seen in days. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I've been thinking about. Because I can't keep doing this, Michael. I can't keep living like this." "Like what?" I demanded. "Like someone who has to face the consequences of her actions? Like someone who feels like a prisoner in her own home?" She shot back, her voice rising. "You think I don't see the way you look at me? Like I'm some problem you have to fix? Like I'm not good enough for you anymore?" Her words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I was too stunned to respond. "Do you even love me anymore?" she asked, her voice breaking. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. And for the first time in days, I didn't have an answer. That night, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us thicker than ever. I thought about the early days of our relationship, back when everything was simple and easy, back when love was enough. But love wasn't enough anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. As I stared at her, I realized that the woman sitting across from me wasn't the same person I'd married. And maybe I wasn't the same man either. We'd both changed, both grown in ways that had pushed us further apart instead of closer together. The question was, could we find our way back? Or were we too far gone? The next morning, Hannah and I moved around each other like ghosts in the same house. I avoided her gaze as I poured coffee, and she didn't say a word as she folded laundry in the living room. The tension between us was suffocating, like a storm that refused to break. I couldn't stop replaying her question from the night before. "Do you even love me anymore?" It was a simple question, but the answer wasn't simple at all. I loved the idea of her, the memory of who we used to be. But now, I didn't know. By late afternoon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I found her in the backyard, sitting on the patio with her legs crossed under her. She had a notebook open in her lap, but her pen hovered above the page, motionless. "Hannah," I said, stepping outside. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't heard me come out. "Hey," she said, her voice wary. "Can we talk?" I asked, sitting down in the chair across from her. She closed the notebook and set it aside. "Okay. I've been thinking about what you said last night," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "About feeling like a prisoner. About me. Looking at you like you're a problem." Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't interrupt. "You're not wrong," I admitted. "I've been angry, and I've been taking it out on you. I don't know how to let it go." Her eyes softened, but there was still a guardedness in her expression. "I've been angry too," she said, "but mostly at myself. I keep asking myself why I did what I did, and the truth is, I don't have a good answer. I was selfish. I wasn't thinking about you or us." I nodded, though her words didn't bring me the closure I'd hoped for. "Do you regret it?" "Every day," she said without hesitation. "But regret doesn't change what happened, does it?" "No," I said quietly. "It doesn't." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of distant traffic filling the void. I wanted to say more, to tell her how lost I felt, how broken this had left me. But the words caught in my throat, too heavy to push out. "Michael," she said after a long pause, "do you think we can fix this? Or are we just pretending?" The honesty in her question took me off guard. For weeks, we'd been circling each other, avoiding the deeper truth of what we both feared, that this might be the end. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to try, but I don't know if that's enough." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to try too, but I'm scared. What if we put everything into this and it still doesn't work? What if we don't try and we end up regretting it for the rest of our lives?" I countered. Her lips curved into a sad smile. "Always the optimist." I shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just not ready to give up yet." That night, we sat at the dining table together for the first time in weeks. The conversation was stilted, awkward, but it was a start. She told me about work, about a new project she was excited about. I told her about a colleague who'd recently become a father and how it had made me think about the future we'd once planned together. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. As I lay in bed later that night, I felt a sliver of hope for the first time in what felt like forever. But even as I clung to that hope, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it might not be enough, that we might already be too fractured to ever be whole again. I pushed the thought aside and closed my eyes, determined to focus on what little progress we'd made. The following days were a strange mix of hope and tension. Hannah and I were trying, in our own ways, to rebuild the fragile connection between us, but the cracks in our foundation were impossible to ignore. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, every shared moment a delicate balancing act. One evening, as I was finishing up some work in the study, I noticed Hannah's phone buzzing on the coffee table in the living room. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the name on the screen caught my eye. Jason. Felt like my chest tightened. Jason. Was this the same guy from the party? The one she'd kissed? My pulse quickened, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed the phone. The message was short. "Can we talk? It's important." The words stared back at me, mocking the progress I thought we'd made. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more damning than the last. Why was he texting her? What was so important that he needed to say it now, weeks after that night? When Hannah came into the room a few minutes later, she froze, her eyes darting from the phone in my hand to the expression on my face. "Michael," she said carefully, "what are you doing?" I held up the phone. "Why is Jason texting you?" Her face paled, and she looked away, her hands twisting nervously. I don't know," she said. "I haven't talked to him since the party." "Then why is he saying it's important?" I pressed, my voice rising. "I don't know," she snapped, her tone defensive. "Maybe he just wants to apologize or clear the air. I didn't ask him to text me." I shook my head, the anger bubbling up inside me. "You expect me to believe that? After everything that's happened?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she stood her ground. "Yes, Michael, I do. Because I've been trying, really trying, to fix this, and I thought you were too. But if you're just going to keep throwing this in my face every time something happens, then what's the point? Her words stung, but I couldn't let go of the doubt gnawing at me. If you're so innocent, then prove it, I said, holding the phone out to her. Reply to him, right now. Tell him not to contact you again. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, and the thought sent a fresh wave of anger and fear through me. But then she took the phone, her fingers trembling as she typed out a response. The message was simple: please don't contact me again. I'm trying to work things out with my husband. She hit send and handed the phone back to me, her eyes blazing with anger. Happy now? She asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the screen, watching as the message was delivered. A part of me felt vindicated, but another part felt hollow. Was this what our marriage had come to? Demanding proof of loyalty like some kind of transaction? Hannah stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I sank onto the couch, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me. I wanted to believe her, to trust that she was telling the truth. But the shadows of doubt were relentless, whispering in my ear that I was being naive. Later that night, I found her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket. The air was cool, and the stars above us seemed impossibly far away. I'm sorry, I said, my voice soft. She didn't look at me. For what? For not trusting you, I admitted. For letting my anger control me. She let out a bitter laugh. It's hard to trust someone when they've given you every reason not to. Her words cut deep, but I knew she was right. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and I couldn't expect her to fix everything on her own. We've both made mistakes, I said, sitting down beside her. But if we're going to make this work, we have to stop punishing each other for them. Otherwise we'll destroy what little we have left, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. We sat there in silence, the cool night air wrapping around us like a fragile truce. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't closure. But it was a start. The days that followed were a blur. Despite our attempts to salvage what was left of our relationship, everything felt like a fragile illusion, hanging by a thread. We went through the motions, talking, eating meals together, sleeping in the same bed, but nothing felt real. Every word we said seemed hollow, every touch laced with unspoken doubt. Hannah was distant in a way I couldn't quite explain. She went back to work, leaving early in the mornings and coming home late, her presence a quiet ghost in our house. I tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking her about her day, but the answers were always short, almost rehearsed. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I caught a glimpse of her, standing by the window, staring outside. Her face was unreadable, her eyes focused somewhere far away, lost in thought. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. What's going on in that head of yours? She didn't turn to look at me. Just thinking. About what? I pressed, wiping my hands on a dish towel. She finally turned to face me, her eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. About how much longer we can keep doing this, Michael. Her words sent a cold chill through me. What do you mean? I mean, how long can we keep pretending everything's fine when it's not? She said, her voice quiet but resolute. How long can we keep pretending that we haven't already ruined everything? I felt my stomach drop. Hannah, don't say that. But she just shook her head. I'm not sure I can keep pretending either. Maybe it's time to face the truth, Michael. Maybe this is over. The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, like the world I'd built was crumbling to dust. Is that what you want? I asked, my voice breaking despite myself. Is that what you really want? She took a step closer to me, her expression unreadable. I don't know anymore. I don't know what I want. The next few days felt like walking through a fog. Every conversation we had seemed to push us further apart, each word a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. There were no more late-night talks, no more attempts at intimacy. We simply existed in the same space, sharing the same air, but nothing felt real anymore. One night, after a particularly silent dinner, I found myself staring at the empty bottle of wine on the kitchen counter, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had happened to us? Where had we gone wrong? I turned to look at Hannah, who was sitting at the table, her eyes fixed on the unfinished glass of wine in front of her. She hadn't said much all evening, and the silence felt heavier than ever. "Hannah," I said quietly, my voice hoarse, "do you want to try again? Do you want to fix this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her glass, swirling the wine inside with a small, distracted motion. "I don't know, Michael. I don't know if I can keep fighting for something that feels so broken." Her words hit me like a blow, but I didn't know how to respond. There was no easy answer, no magic words to fix the mess we'd made of our lives. "I don't know what else to do," I said finally, the frustration bubbling over. "I love you, but I don't know how to make things right. I don't even know if you love me anymore." She set her glass down, her hands trembling slightly. "I still love you, Michael," she said softly, "but love doesn't seem to be enough anymore. It never has been." The room felt suffocating, and I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't bear the weight of her words, the uncertainty of our future. "I'm going out," I said, though I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to escape, even if for a little while. "Hannah," I said, turning to look at her one last time before I left, "I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know if we can fix this." She didn't say anything in return. She just looked at me, her eyes tired, like she had already said everything she could say. I drove aimlessly for hours, the streets blurring by in a haze. The weight of the night, of everything we'd been through, pressed down on me with an intensity one couldn't shake. I wanted to believe that things could get better, that we could find a way back to each other. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we were both too far gone. The silence between us had become a chasm too wide to bridge. When I finally returned home, it was late. The house was dark, and I found Hannah asleep on the couch, her head resting against the armrest. She looked peaceful in that moment, but the quiet resignation in her face told me everything I needed to know. I stood in the doorway for a while, watching her sleep. There was a time when I would have never imagined a life without her, but now the thought felt all too real. The days dragged on like a slow, agonizing pull through mud. No matter how much I wanted things to get better, the more I tried, the further away we seemed to drift. Every word between Hannah and me felt strained, every moment together filled with a quiet, unspoken tension. I woke up early that morning, the weight of the night before still pressing down on my chest. Hannah had slept through the night, but even in the stillness of the room, I could feel the distance between us. We were two strangers sharing the same space, pretending to be something we no longer were. I went through the motions of my morning routine: shower, coffee, breakfast, but nothing felt real. I couldn't escape the feeling that we were just playing roles, acting out a life we no longer recognized. When I finally saw her in the kitchen, she was staring at the coffee maker, the steam rising from her cup like some kind of smoke signal. She didn't turn around when I entered, didn't greet me. The silence between us felt deafening. "I'm going out," I said after a long pause. She nodded without looking at me, her expression unreadable. "Okay." I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there anymore. The house, our home, felt like a prison. I needed air, needed to think, needed to figure out what the hell I was doing. I drove aimlessly, the streets of the city becoming a blur as I struggled to make sense of everything. What was I even doing? Why was I holding on to something that was slipping through my fingers like sand? I thought about Hannah's face when she told me she didn't know if she could keep fighting. I thought about her tears, the way her shoulders slumped as if she was already mourning the loss of what we once had. And I thought about me, about the man I'd become. Had I changed so much that I couldn't see who I was anymore? Was I so wrapped up in my own anger, my own insecurities, that I couldn't even recognize the person who once loved her with everything he had? I parked in a random lot, the engine of the car still running as I sat there, staring out at the empty streets. The world around me was moving, but I was stuck. It was hours before I went back home, and when I did, the house was eerily quiet. It felt colder, emptier somehow. I found Hannah in the living room, sitting on the couch, her legs pulled up to her chest. She looked up when I entered, her face pale, her eyes heavy with something unspoken. "I went to see a therapist today," she said, her voice soft, almost distant. The words hit me like a brick. "What? Why?" I asked, my throat tightening. "Because I don't know how to fix this, Michael," she replied, her voice cracking. "I don't know if we can fix this, but I had to try. I have to try. For me. For us." I felt something in me snap at her words, a sharp pang of guilt and frustration twisting in my gut. I had been so consumed by my own pain, by my own doubts, that I hadn't even considered that she was struggling too. "What did they say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged, her eyes not meeting mine. "They said I have to be honest with myself. That we both do. And I think I've been avoiding the truth." I swallowed hard, suddenly afraid of where this conversation was going. "What truth?" "I think I've been staying because I don't know who I am without you," she said quietly. "But I don't know if that's enough anymore. I don't know if I'm enough for either of us." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Couldn't breathe. Every part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she was everything I wanted, that I still loved her more than anything. But I couldn't say the words, not when I wasn't sure they were true anymore. "Are we just supposed to keep pretending?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we supposed to keep living like this, when we both know it's not working?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what the hell we're doing anymore, Hannah." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, as if looking for some sign of the man she had once loved. And for the first time in months, I didn't know if I was still that man. The night dragged on in agonizing silence. We both stayed in the living room, avoiding each other's gaze, lost in our own thoughts. At one point, I got up to go to bed, but when I turned off the lights, I found myself standing there in the dark, paralyzed by the weight of it all. Could we fix this? Could we even try anymore? The next morning, I woke up early, the house still quiet, still heavy with the tension from the night before. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if it was even worth trying. But then I remembered something, a small, insignificant memory from the early days of our relationship. I remembered how we used to laugh, how easy it used to be to talk to her. And I wondered, just for a moment, if that was still possible. But as I looked over at her sleeping form, I knew deep down that things had changed. We had changed. Maybe it was too late to go back. Maybe it had always been too late. I walked out of the room, my heart heavy with the realization that we were at the breaking point. And this time there was no going back. The days after that morning became even more distant, like two people living in the same house but in different worlds. I returned, hoping things would feel different, but the house was still silent, the air still heavy. Hannah was there, but she wasn't really present. Her eyes were often vacant, like she was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't reach. It was early evening when I found her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The remote was in her hand, but she wasn't even paying attention to the screen. I sat down next to her, the space between us like an abyss. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I said quietly, unable to hold it in anymore. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes never left the screen, but I could feel the weight of her silence. "I'm not sure either," she whispered finally, her voice breaking the stillness like glass shattering. I wanted to ask more, to reach out, but the words stuck in my throat. What was left to say? What could we possibly fix when everything felt so broken? I stood up and walked out, not knowing where I was going but feeling like I was slipping further and further away from her. The next day, I found a message from her on my phone. She had gone to see a therapist. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I had no idea she was struggling that much. For the first time, I felt like I had lost her, like I was no longer even a part of her life. When I came home that evening, I found her waiting in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. She didn't need to say anything. I could see it in her eyes. She was done. "I don't know if I can keep fighting for this," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can keep pretending things are okay when they're not. And just like that, everything we'd worked for seemed to slip away. It was like we were both standing on the edge, knowing there was no way back. I spent the next few days in a haze, going through the motions but never really being present. The house felt empty, even when she was there. I could see the pain in her eyes every time we spoke, and it broke me more than I cared to admit. I wanted to fix it, wanted to go back to the way things were. But I didn't know if we could. One night I came home late, and she wasn't there. Her things were still in the house, but there was an eerie absence, as if she had already left. I sat down, the weight of it all crashing over me. The empty space between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional, too, and I didn't know how to fill it anymore. That night, I found myself standing by the window, staring out at the streetlights. I thought about all the things we had once shared, the laughter, the warmth, the feeling of being complete. And then I thought about how far away those memories seemed now, like they belonged to a different life, one I couldn't even recognize anymore. Hannah walked in quietly behind me, and for a moment we both just stood there. I didn't turn to look at her, but I felt her presence like a shadow, lingering between us. "I don't know what to do anymore," I said softly. "I don't know how we got here." She stepped closer but didn't touch me. "Maybe we never knew how to fix it. Maybe we've been broken for longer than we realized." And in that moment I knew the truth. We had reached the end. There was no magic fix, no moment of clarity that would make everything right. We were both too far gone, too lost in our own pain to find each other again. I didn't say anything else that night. I didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. When I went to bed, the bed felt too big, too empty. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how much I had already lost. The days after that night were the hardest. Hannah and I had become two ghosts in the same house, drifting past each other with a kind of quiet resignation. She went to work. I stayed home, caught in the tangled mess of my thoughts. Neither of us made an effort to bridge the silence. It felt like the end was looming over us, like a storm we had been waiting for but never wanted to arrive. One afternoon, I came home to find her sitting on the couch, her suitcase beside her. The sight of it made my heart race, the finality of it hitting me in the gut. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just stared ahead, as if she was already gone in every way that mattered. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to say a word. Everything I wanted to say felt so inadequate. How do you explain years of love and pain in a single sentence? How do you fight for something when you know it's already lost? "I'm leaving, Michael," she said, her voice steady but filled with something I couldn't name. Was it sadness? Was it relief? I wasn't sure. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The words I wanted to say were tangled in my throat, but I knew that saying anything wouldn't change the truth. She was leaving. We were done. "I'm sorry," she added softly, her voice breaking, though she didn't look at me. "I never wanted it to end like this, but I don't know how to keep going." I felt something deep inside me crack as I looked at her, standing there, her back turned, the finality of her departure written all over her. I wanted to tell her that I loved her, that I would fight for us, but I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I had it in me anymore, and maybe that was the saddest part of all. I had already given so much of myself, and now there was nothing left. "Goodbye, Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and just like that, she was gone. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. I spent the next few days in a haze, the absence of her presence filling every corner of the house. Felt empty in ways I couldn't explain. I wandered from room to room, the memories of our time together haunting me. The kitchen where we used to cook meals together, the living room where we spent lazy afternoons, all of it felt like a dream I could no longer hold on to. The reality of it all hit me like a wave, and I felt myself drowning in regret. What could I have done differently? How could we have avoided this? But the questions didn't matter. The damage was done. It was the loneliest I had ever felt. A week later, I ran into her at a cafe. She was sitting with a friend, laughing. It was strange to see her so carefree, so distant from the woman I had known. She looked happy, and a part of me wanted to believe that she was better off, that this was what she needed. But the other part of me, the part that still loved her, felt a bitter sting of jealousy. How could she move on so easily? How could she leave everything we built behind? She didn't see me at first, but when she did, her smile faltered for just a second. Our eyes locked across the room, and for a moment, it was like we were the only two people in the world. There was so much left unsaid between us. So many things we never finished, so many apologies never spoken. She stood up, hesitated, and then walked toward me. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but also a kind of finality, like she was ready to close the door on us once and for all. "Hi," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Hi," I replied, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. We stood there for a long moment, both of us unsure of what to say, unsure of how to navigate this strange new version of our relationship. "I'm sorry for everything," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. "For the way I left. For everything." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't angry at her anymore. I was angry at myself, for not seeing the signs earlier, for not recognizing how far apart we had grown. "I'm sorry too," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I should have done more. I should have been better." She nodded, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe we both should have." And in that moment I knew that there was no going back, no undoing the past. We had both changed, grown in ways that meant we couldn't fit together anymore. We had reached the end of our story. "I guess this is it then," I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. She looked at me one last time, her eyes full of sadness, but also a kind of peace. "Yeah, I think it is." And with that, we turned away from each other, each of us stepping into our separate lives. The door between us had finally closed, and there was no coming back. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, I realize that this story, like many others, doesn't have a neat, happy ending. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, two people can grow apart and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But even in the pain, there's something valuable to learn. So, what do you think? Have you ever been in a relationship like this, where it felt like everything was falling apart, but you didn't know how to fix it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been through something similar, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we have to learn the most painfully.